Welcome to Miami Preserves, the podcast where we explore historic places in Miami and what it means to preserve our history. I'm your host, Lucia Meneses, and I'm also the school programs manager at Dade Heritage Trust. In 1972, a nonprofit organization called Dade Heritage Trust was established with a mission to preserve Miami-Dade County's architectural, environmental, and cultural heritage through education, advocacy, and preservation. In this podcast, we're going to focus on Miami history and preservation through the lens of African American historic sites. We'll hear from scholars and historians with firsthand experience and knowledge of what it was like during the era of segregation in Miami. But we'll also hear from teachers and students and how they are navigating some of the changes in education happening in Florida, specifically things like censorship and expansion of parental rights. In today's episode, we'll provide some background on the history of segregation in Miami and some preservation efforts in the African American community.
I remember the first time I realized that being black was a problem.
That's Dr. Marvin Dunn, retired professor from Florida International University and renowned Florida historian and activist who specializes in Black Florida history.
Must have been 46. I was in school, first grade, because I knew what it meant to stand in line. I go to the post office. This is in DeLand, Florida, near Orlando, with my mom. We were in line, and these white people kept getting in front of my mother. They would take these people before my mom. So when we got out of the post office, I asked her, why do those people keep getting in front of us? And she said, because we're colored. It was the first time I realized being colored meant you had to be behind somebody else.
Miami, like the rest of the South, was subject to Jim Crow laws, which enforced racial segregation in public spaces. But obviously, segregation and discrimination were not only limited to public spaces. It impacted where Black people were allowed to live.
This is the Negro section, confined to 4 square miles. There is a marked contrast between unpainted wooden shanties and new CBS houses. The same contrast exists between asphalt-paved streets and several miles of sandy cowpath road. The exterior appearance of the Negro section differs from the white area.
I spoke to Megan McLaughlin. She works for Pluserbia Design, which is an urban planning and urban design firm based here in Miami. And DHT has worked with her company to conduct surveys or inventories of historic neighborhoods throughout Miami, including historic Black neighborhoods such as Brownsville and Liberty City.
What we were able to uncover about Brownsville was really kind of astounding. Brownsville, there's a lot of great talking points about why it's so significant, but I would say it produced many of the first Black elected officials at local and state level in Florida's history. It was really a haven for the Black middle class when segregation was still strong in Florida. And so since the end of World War II until the Fair Housing Act of 1968, so let's say a 20-year span, it was the premier Black middle-class neighborhood. It was like really a destination for those that could afford to move out there and buy their own home. And as a result of that tight-knit community, the neighbors were able to advocate for a better life for their children.
So I was under the impression that Brownsville was originally a white neighborhood, and that as soon as Black families started to move in, the white families moved out. But Megan explained that's not entirely accurate.
Brownsville, as a neighborhood, is named after a Black man. His name was William Brown. And surprisingly, that's one of the facts that has been confused over time, is that this question of the identity of who was Mr. Brown. We were able to confirm through census information and through old newspapers that, in fact, Mr. William Brown and his wife, Martha Brown, were a Black couple. They were farmers. They were both born as slaves. And by 1900, they were in Miami working on truck farms, which is what small farming operations were called at that time. They happened to have a little bit of high ground on their property that by 1916, they actually subdivided it to become Brown's subdivision. As far as I can tell, William Brown and his wife, Martha Brown, were the first Black developers in Dade County, which is really exciting. And so I think this narrative, I guess, that Brownsville was a white neighborhood that became Black through blockbusting, it's not accurate, because we know that Brown was actually one of maybe 10 Black farmers living in this kind of cluster on the edge of the Everglades, farming tomatoes and beans and even some sugar cane during World War I.
In her research, Megan learned how the origins of urban planning are actually rooted in racism. That many of the first zoning codes that were passed were based on segregation. Zoning codes basically dictate what you can and cannot build. And it's important to note that racial zoning was actually found to be unconstitutional in 1917. But nevertheless, cities and counties, including Miami-Dade County around the country, found ways to implement racial zoning. And as a result, Black individuals were confined to overcrowded, substandard housing in neighborhoods like Overtown, Liberty City, and West Coconut Grove. In Miami, a wall was actually built to separate Blacks from whites next to Liberty Square Housing Project, a low-income housing development that opened in the 1930s. And some of this goes back to the New Deal. Here's Megan to tell you more about that.
One of the ways we got out of our depression as a country was the New Deal, which did a great thing for communities. And what I didn't understand is in a lot of cases, the New Deal helped America, but it helped white America in terms of getting completely rethinking and revolutionizing the way that we do homeownership, for instance. So the New Deal, one arm of it was to trigger this market for small homes for homeownership to stabilize the economy, to give work to the construction industry, which is like totally paused. I mean, I think everyone's heard of the term redlining, but the term redlining specifically comes from these maps that the federal government made that would basically say, this neighborhood's a safe investment and this neighborhood is not. And this is the neighborhood where we, the federal government, are going to give home loans that are low interest, low monthly payment, safe. And in Miami, like a lot of the Southwest that we know of now as like Shenandoah, Silver Bluff, the Roads, Coral Gables, all of those areas were mapped as a safe investment and they got a flood of federal loans. And pretty much the entire northwest of Miami was marked red, so for the redlining, and it was deemed a hazardous investment by the federal government. And in all the forms for each neighborhood, it would say availability of mortgage loans, none.
Would they specify like why?
Yes, yeah. An automatic trigger to become a red neighborhood was if you had Black residents.
Public schools were deeply segregated, with Black students attending separate, underfunded institutions. Today, Miami is known for its beaches, but back then, even saltwater was segregated.
Before the railroad came in 1896, there were Black people here, and they were allowed to swim in salt water. It was after the railroad came in that Blacks could no longer go into the ocean. And that was the impetus for starting Virginia Key Beach in the 1940s, mainly by these Black veterans and ministers who insisted upon having a beach for Black people.
Virginia Key Beach, I should add, is part of DHT's African American Heritage Education Program for students in grades 4 through 12. This program was created to educate and celebrate Miami's Black history, and includes additional venues such as the Hampton House, which you'll hear about in this episode, and the Black Police Precinct and Courthouse Museum. But here's Dr. Dunn with some background on how this beach came about and why it's so significant.
When the Second World War started, Miami was a very popular place for training military people because of the weather. It could train people year-round. And the Navy was training people at Crandon Park, training white sailors to swim at Crandon Park. But Dade County would not allow them to take Black sailors out there to train them to swim. So Dade County allowed the Navy to use Virginia Key as a training site for Black sailors. The war is over in 1945, and the Navy gives the property back to the county, and that's the end of Virginia Key. 1946, Blacks demand that beach for Blacks. The county says no. And there's a demonstration, a wade-in at Haulover Beach, and the Virginia Key Beach decision was made within weeks of that demonstration. The point I'm trying to make is that was happening before the Civil Rights Movement was taking place any place else. This was before North Carolina and the students sit in. We had a wade-in Dade County to bring about the existence of a Black beach. And that speaks volumes for who was here at the end of that Second World War and the Black community who had the kind of leadership to push that goal forward.
And you remember swimming there as a kid. Can you paint us a picture of what that was like?
The first time I tasted salt water, I thought you were supposed to eat it.
Oh, no.
It's salty.
Did that make you sick?
No. It was wonderful. We would go out there many, many Sundays. I cannot tell you how peaceful and wonderful and musical and great it was. I never saw a fight. No one ever pulled a weapon at Virginia Key. There were no police out there. There was no need for them. It was just where we went to have great, great fun. We didn't know that there was a sewage treatment plant right around the corner. If we had known, it wouldn't have made any difference. But that's one reason why they allowed Virginia Key to be used, because it was so close to the treatment facility. But no, that was a great time in my life as a child. You tend to remember your childhood as being great, however your childhood might have been. But going to Virginia Key was a highlight. We didn't get to do it very often, but it was great.
And even when segregation became illegal after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it still persisted in housing, education, and economic opportunities. Miami's neighborhoods remained largely segregated by race. But by the 1950s and 60s, Florida was trying to redefine itself in an effort to attract tourists and businesses.
Have you seen the old postcards that they sent out of Miami when Miami was founded?
I've seen some at the Hampton House.
Showing alligators attacking black babies in the Everglades, and they've come visit South Florida.
Oh my God, I haven't seen those.
I have a collection of them. When Miami was founded, there was a need to attract people to come down here. And what would be the attraction? Exotic Miami.
One thing is sure, you don't have to travel far to see interesting things in Florida. Just hop in the car and travel to something new and something strange.
It was put forward as a place that was unusual in that sense. And the way that blacks were depicted was as workers, laborers, but also as clowns, as the subjects of white humor. And there was a whole collection of racist postcards that were specifically sent out of Miami.
Interestingly, this made me think of the name Jim Crow, which is commonly used to describe segregation laws, and how it comes from this idea of blacks as a subject of white humor. It's actually based on a theater character popularized during minstrel shows in the mid-1800s. Jim Crow was a stereotypical depiction of African Americans, and the actors who played Jim Crow would often dress in blackface and rags.
Later, when Miami and Florida tried to project itself as being not Southern, and that happened in the late 40s into the 50s because Florida was trying to attract Disney here. So by the early 1950s, Florida went on a major effort to redefine itself as being different from the other Southern states and welcoming Northerners to come in and welcoming new businesses. And we're not a Southern state, and that's how that image started to be projected on purpose by the state of Florida.
The demographic landscape of Miami began to change significantly with the influx of immigrants from the Caribbean and Latin America, altering the city's racial dynamics. Today, Miami remains a diverse city, but issues of racial and economic disparities continue to be relevant. Gentrification, housing affordability, and access to quality education and healthcare are ongoing concerns that disproportionately affect minority communities. That's not to say that we haven't made progress. Here's what Dr. Dunn had to say about race relations today.
So that's been my basis of academic work for years, understanding race relations in our country and in our community. As someone who has looked at this and studied it for 40 years, I don't think that we are nearly as racially divided as it would appear. I think most people in our country are of goodwill. I don't believe that most white people are racist. I don't believe that most black people are dangerous. I think that the divide between us is exaggerated and that race is being used as a cudgel to keep us apart for political reasons. Beneath it all, to me, we still have a strong country and a good country and the best country in the world, and I hope that we preserve it.
Let's focus on that for a minute. To preserve. Dade Heritage Trust, or DHT, is, after all, a historic preservation organization. So what preservation efforts have been made to save some of Miami's most iconic African-American spaces? I had the pleasure of speaking to Dr. Enid Curtis Pinkney, a Miami native, retired educator, and historic preservationist. At one point, she served on the board of trustees for Dade Heritage Trust as president, and during her time as president, she helped to save the Miami Circle from demolition, the Circle being an ancient archaeological site. Here she is talking about saving the historic Hampton House.
Dr. Martin Luther King used to stay there. Muhammad Ali stayed there. The Markovits, which was a Jewish couple, built the Hampton House, and I used to go there. It was an elegant place, and it was where anybody who was somebody would end up. Everybody wanted to be at the Hampton House.
The Hampton House was the first luxury motel for African Americans, featuring 50 hotel rooms, a jazz club, restaurant, and swimming pool. It opened in 1953 as a Green Book hotel. Unable to stay at hotels in Miami Beach, African Americans were welcomed at the Hampton House. It closed after segregation was abolished.
But over the years, it deteriorated after the Markovits were there no longer and their children weren't interested. So Kathy Hirsch asked if a black group, because she was white, would take on the leadership and trying to preserve it because of its history.
Kathy Hirsch, by the way, is a journalist and documentarian who approached Enid about taking on this project.
So I said I would get a group to do that. And we started out with the African American Committee of Dade Heritage Trust. But then it got to be too much. The building had become a derelict building, and the neighbors were complaining about the homeless staying in there, the drug addicts, the prostitutes, and what they considered undesirables. So they were petitioning the county to tear it down.
Enid appealed to the county mayor at the time, Alex Penelas, and together they organized a huge event at the Hampton House with food and music to rally support for saving the building.
The mayor spoke and he said, if we can spend $26 million to save the circle, we can spend some money to save a piece of black history. And then the county bought the building. And that's how we got started.
Eventually, the Hampton House was restored and is currently open to the public as a museum and event space. But it took about 10 years from the time Enid first embarked on this project to the museum's grand opening. Were you starting to lose hope at this point?
No, I was determined.
Okay.
You know, I just feel that you have to keep on. And so what we've done, we accepted what they've offered, and at least we're open to the public.
All this to say that saving historic places isn't easy, but it was really inspiring to hear Enid's determination despite everything she's been through. She credits her father for giving her so much courage. But she told me about an incident in her adult life when she was confronted with the lasting consequences of segregation. It happened one day when she was boarding a plane to Exuma, Bahamas, where her family is from.
When the door opened on the plane and the stewardess came through and I could see who the pilots were. The pilots were black. I had never seen a black pilot before. I was scared. Now, I had finished college and everything, but I had never seen a black pilot.
What were you scared of?
I was scared that they didn't know what they were doing. The plane was going to come down. I said, I wonder if they know what they're doing. And then I realized what segregation had done to me. But nobody cared about that. Nobody still cares about that.
In 2009, Enid was notified about a housing development being constructed on top of an unmarked black cemetery in Lemon City. Records revealed the names of 523 African Americans buried there. Just like the Hampton House, for Enid, this was personal. She discovered something about her own family when browsing through the list of 523 names.
I was looking in the seas for Cunningham, and I came down Clark. And I looked, and I saw John Clark. Died, I think it was 1923. I said, my grandfather's name was John Clark. I wonder if this is my grandfather. But I needed a little more proof, so I looked, I kept reading, and I saw that he was from Exuma. I said, oh, my grandmother was from Exuma, Bahamas. And when I kept looking where it said spouse, it said Melvina Clark. I said, that's my grandmother. I was so shocked to see my grandmother's name on that list. And I believe that my grandfather was guiding me from heaven, because I don't know how I got into that, but I believe that he wanted this story told.
That's what many of us are trying to do, to help preserve the stories and legacies of Miami's African American heritage. At DHT, we believe that the first step in preserving anything is education. That's what we're going to focus on in the next episode. You'll hear from a few educators about how they are navigating some of the current restrictions surrounding Black history education in Florida, and their reactions after visiting some historic Black venues in Miami for the first time. Thank you for listening to Miami Preserves. Miami Preserves is produced by me, Lucia Meneses, with sound engineering and editing by Forrest Kennedy. The views expressed by the speakers on this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of Dade Heritage Trust, its board of directors, or its members. Special thanks to the Wolfson Family Foundation for sponsoring this project. And thank you to all the guests featured in today's episode.
I am Dr. Marvin Dunn,
who started a nonprofit in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd called the Miami Center for Racial Justice, with a mission to preserve the true Black Florida history. Learn about their Teach the Truth tours and more by visiting miamicenterforracialjustice.org.
Enid Curtis Pinkney,
who continues to advocate for her community through a foundation she started in honor of her parents, the Curtis Foundation.
My name's Megan McLaughlin.
You can find all those historic neighborhood surveys and more on her website, plusurbia.com. That's PLUSURBIA.com. To learn more about Dade Heritage Trust and for a complete transcript of episodes, visit our website, dadeheritagetrust.org. And be sure to follow and subscribe to the Miami Preserves podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Tune in for episode 2.
They want to protect white students from feeling bad about the things that the Ku Klux Klan has done. The full story needs to be told, and somebody needs to tell Governor DeSantis that prejudice is in charge.